All right, so today we're going to talk about scenario planning in Park Plus, and that will include several things. What is scenario planning? What does it mean? Why do we do it? How do we do it? We'll go through an overview of what that data looks like and how you use that data for different iterations, and then we'll have some examples at the end. What do you need to build scenarios? So the components of a successful scenario analysis. There are some basic things you'll need, and then there are other things that you can add on to look at different things, such as multimodal changes or land use changes or parking changes or policy changes and how those affect behavior. We'll talk a little bit about the types of scenarios that have been evaluated that we do here at Kimley-Horn, as well as some of y'all are doing already with your model on your end. We'll do an example, and I've got a 5-step example that I'm going to show you working through kind of what does it look like to run a scenario, and then we'll talk about what's next. So in terms of scenario planning process, just a pretty easy definition is using calibrated conditions to define how changes to the built, operational, and transportation environments will influence parking behavior. And so calibrated is the main word there, because we're taking the data from your community that we've collected with parking occupancy and land use and all the relationships between them, and using that data to predict how the future of parking will look as you add new population, or you add new buildings and land uses, or you add new parking facilities or change policy. In some situations, there's not calibrated data. So Oklahoma City, who's on the phone today, we're doing a study with them right now where we're looking at basically a greenfield site south of their downtown, and we're using projected conditions from other communities as well as national averages to look at what that looks like. But in most cases, we're going to have data that we've collected and put into the model that is calibrated to your community, and that's the essence of scenario planning. And that's not to say for folks like Oklahoma City that in the future, as they've got this, they're going to be able to go in and calibrate conditions to different locations in their community and be able to look at these same types of scenarios that are community specific. So when we talk about scenario planning, what's typically included? Well, there's land use evaluation, so looking at changes in land use, adding new land use, redevelopment of existing sites, and the screen you're seeing on the screen right now, the screenshot is from our new development tab in Park Plus, where you can go in and change the value of the land use, or how big it is, or the adjusted rate of how it's parking. And you see some of those adjusted rates are really nice, clean, 3.8, 6.5, 3.6, and then some of them are long decimal places from data that's been calibrated and modeled. And I'll show you the difference between the two of those in just a second. We look at parking infrastructure changes, so changing the number of spaces, taking new facilities and adding them to the model, or taking facilities away, looking at how those are operating within a shared parking environment, things like that. We can look at pricing changes, so we can go in and influence what hourly or transient rates look like, or daily or monthly rates look like for different facilities, and how does that change the behavior of the parker as they are working through the community in the model. And then there's shared parking arrangements. Again, so looking at, is this a private facility? Is this a public facility? What happens if I make it a private facility or I make it a public facility? How does that influence the way parking is operating in the community? And we'll look at an example of that. And then there's TDM strategies, so looking at what happens if I overlay different strategies. And again, this is more from the theoretical side of things. So what if I implement smart growth principles, or I have remote parking facilities? How does that affect the demand in a certain selection area? And so we can look at these as we go through. And this is not meant to say that this is the only 5 things we do with scenario planning, but for the most part, these are the ones that we deal with on an ongoing basis as we're working with your peers across the country. So there are a number of things that other people are now starting to do when they look at scenario planning. There's events, there's traffic impacts, so taking parking away from traffic impacts and looking at temporary things that we're starting to understand the benefits of as people are using this model. So then what are the components of scenario planning as we look at it? So there are two, for those that have had a discussion about what the data is in the model, there are really two things that are the points of data in this model. There's land use and there's parking. So each of those have components in scenario planning. So with land uses, there are new land uses and the type and intensity of those and the location of those. There are also redevelopments or taking away land uses. There are parking generation rates associated with those land uses, and there are a number of ways to get those. Our preferred method is to use calibrated data from the model to predict how new land uses are going to operate similar to existing land uses. And then there's allocation. So where does that land use park? Is there some type of private relationship or shared parking relationship that needs to be modeled? Does it fall inside a user group? For those in the university realm, is it student parking? Is it faculty parking? Is it visitor parking? So we need to go in and define what all of those are as we develop our scenarios so that we can realistically model what's happening. From the parking side of things, there are parking facilities, so we're either adding or removing them, the location of those, and that's one of the interesting things about Park Plus is we can go in and really look at different locations. And an example would be a study we just completed with the city of Tempe. We looked at several locations for new parking facilities based on what was available in the downtown area. And we were able to tell them based on where we put these public parking facilities the greatest impact for capturing public demand, creating support for land uses around it, so we could look at kind of the one-off of the infrastructure planning. There's also price, so looking at what does the price facility do to the demand that's in it compared to those that are around it, and then again those allocations, so land uses that are restricted to parking, or again user groups, the faculty, student, employee, visitor, those types of things. So those are the real components of scenario planning, and again we can go into multimodal, we can look at time of day, those types of things, but those are adjustment factors in the Park Plus model as we're modeling things. So how does scenario planning work? And so just before we get into the example, I want to show you kind of a graphic of how that works. But before we do that, a refresher from the last Lunch and Learn that we had. So we talked about calibration in the last Lunch and Learn and how that works and how we take your data and go from parking data and land use data to calibrated conditions in a model. And we start with land uses. We have parking facilities that are associated with this area, and then we have walking tolerances that are defined based on user input and our understanding of a study area. So in this example, the gray boxes are our parking, the purple boxes are our land uses, and the dashed lines are our walking tolerances around those parking facilities. And so in that situation, it's pairing up land uses and parking facilities based on how far people are willing to walk. And there's, shared parking opportunities, there's crossover between different facilities, but we take that data and we look at the actual demand that was measured in the field when we did occupancy studies, or you did occupancy studies, or it came from your revenue control equipment, and we compare that to the theoretical demand from a ULI or an ITE or a city or county code or whatever the source is that you want to use. And in that comparison, we create those adjusted parking generation rates. So there's a calculation that takes place that looks at each of those and adjusts them up or down based on how your parking is actually operating. And if you've seen the white paper that was distributed about calibration, it has the formulas and everything in there. But it's relatively simple, but a way for us to adjust how your parking in your community or campus operates versus how a ULI or an ITE or one of those national organizations might think it should operate based on their limited data. So I show you that because scenario planning operates in much the same way, but in reverse. So again, we have those same land uses. We have those same parking facilities, and we have the same walking tolerances, but the walking tolerances this time, instead of going from parking to land use, are from land use to parking. So now we're saying if a land use creates demand, and they're willing to walk X feet, where could they walk within the radius of that demand? And so it's now pairing up potential parking facilities with land uses that are creating demand. And it's using that adjusted generation rate that we calculate in calibration as well as all those allocation settings, public, private, user groups, to allocate demand to parking facilities within those walking distances. So it's the same process without the comparison of actual and theoretical. It's just using now the adjustments that are based on that to calculate demand and send it out into the world, basically, with those different user inputs. So with that, I'm going to stop real quick and say, are there any questions about that? Does that make sense, or does anybody have any concern or issues?
No.
Okay.
Go ahead.
All right, good. So and again, a lot of this is in that white paper. Again, you'll find that on the user group website or on the Kimley Horn website. And if you don't have access to that or would like a copy, shoot me an email, let me know, and I can get you all this stuff, because we're trying to make this as transparent as possible for you as you're modeling. So with that, before we jump into the example, which is what I want to spend the majority of the time we have here, again, how do we use this? Testing the ability of parking to satisfy new development. So when you're looking at your system of public and private parking, knowing what is available, what isn't available, how do we allow new development to come into the community, and do we have to build parking specifically for it, or can it be satisfied within the system that you have today? A lot of people are using this for master planning purposes, and again, Oklahoma City goes back to that example where we're master planning a very undeveloped area in their community to understand what parking needs would be relevant to different development levels. And Fort Collins did the same thing, where they looked at, this is what 5, 10, 20 years out looks like in our downtown. What kind of parking do we need? What kind of policy or pricing strategies should we do? Evaluating infrastructure, so looking at the sizing, the location, who can use it to best manage demands and balance demands within the system. Looking at different policies, and again, that goes back to pricing or management. I've got management practices specific, because in a lot of our university settings, we'll look at permitting, and whether that's creating new permit strategies or combining strategies or allocating more spaces to different permit types, so that we're balancing that demand and making the parking system work within the framework of the campus. And then looking at mode split, so as transit ridership or walkability or biking increases, what does that do to parking behavior, and how do we best understand that within the confines of this model? So those are, again, kind of the top 5 or 6 things that we are using it for now, but there are people that are taking this outside of those and finding new things to do with it. So with that, we've spent the first 15 or so minutes on kind of the theory, and that's about all I want to spend before you fall asleep. So let's take a look at the actual model itself. So I'm going to show you an example today of kind of a 5-step scenario planning process that begins with adding land uses, adding parking, looking at shared parking, looking at changes to mode split, and then looking at some parking management stuff. So I'll start with, let's pull up our model that we've got built, and I'll explain what we're looking at. But an example that I've got for today, this is an office park we're actually doing a Park Plus modeling effort for right now in Reston, Virginia. So they're looking at taking what was 3 office buildings and redeveloping it into residential, retail, restaurant, and office on site. And then what does the parking mix need to be to best meet the needs on site? And so I've got, this is probably phase 4 of that, so there's a bunch of different land uses built into it. But we'll go ahead and run the model real quick, and then what we're going to do is start overlaying new land uses on top of that. We'll add a mixed-use tower that's got residential units, office, and retail all in one, that allows us to look at what that demand would be. So the first step in doing that is simply just drawing in our new tower and adding in the information related to it. And that's what we'll do as soon as this stops running. All right, so with our model that we've got now, again, for those that haven't spent a lot of time with the back end of this or working with it, the outputs of the model coming out are numeric, so we understand for the study area wide, we've got 2,753 spaces of demand. 3,067 spaces of supply, a surplus of 314 spaces. There's also a latent demand, this number down here, of 272, and that means that within the confines of this model, there are certain land uses that could not park their demand because of walking distance or private parking restrictions that did not allow them to park. And so a good example would be this land use right here that's showing up yellow or slightly yellower. Could not park in here because this is restricted to some other user. So we could go into our allocation table and see what that was. And then there are parking facilities over here that are blue or less than 50% occupied because they're outside of the walking distance of the land uses down here that are latent. So we'll look at what happens if we change those restrictions in a second when we get into shared parking. And then we could also go back and change the walking distance too. But for reference, the walking distance on this site is about 500 feet, which is pretty small, but the client that we're modeling this for wanted to keep it somewhat small so that we could model less than urban conditions, if you will. But the first thing we're going to do, we're going to go in and build a new land use, and we'll start there. So you've got your land use layer, you've got your parking layer, and then latent demand and calibrated occupancy are both outputs from that run we just did. So we're going to work with these two layers. In fact, I'm going to take these out for right now so we don't get convoluted. So we're going to work first with this tan layer, the land use. So I'm simply going to go in and start editing features, and that's going to give me the ability to go in and draw new land uses within this model. So I'll click Create Features and Land Use, and I'm just going to start with a rectangle, but you can use any of these shapes to kind of define the boundaries of your land use. But right here in the middle of this open courtyard, we're going to build a new residential tower. So we'll just draw it like that, and if I go into my attribute table, which contains all the data associated with this, you'll see that there is no information about it, so everything is null. So our rates, our square footage, our value, all of those things are null. So we'll go in and add that information in just a second. But we also, remember, we're going to add retail, office, and residential into this example. So I can't add that into one land use. I've got to have one for retail, one for office, and one for residential. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to right-click here and copy that. I'm going to paste it, and it's going to ask me where do I want to paste that. We don't want to paste it in parking because it's not a parking. It's a land use. So we want to show that it's going into that land use attribute table. So we pasted it once. Let's paste again, the exact same thing. So now if I open my land use and I select that again, I've got 3, and they're the exact same size, the exact same length, area, all of those things. So we basically have built multiple layers of this tower geospatially on top of one another, and so they've got the same X and Y coordinates, and so that works well within the Park Plus model because now we're modeling it all in the same place. So the next thing we would do is go in and add information about that land use so that the model knows what it's modeling. So the easiest thing is, let's just start with the name. So we'll new development, and we'll call this our office, and this is our new development. We'll call this our retail. New development. We'll call this our residential. So that's pretty easy. So we also know, I know the square footages are what I'm going to be using. So for office, I was going to put in 75,000 square feet. For retail, I'm going to put in 50,000 square feet. And for the residential, I'm not worried about that because it's not based on square footage. It's based on the number of units. So I'll go here. I'm not worried about units here. We'll put in 100. And then really the true column that is the most concern when you're doing this is the value column, because that's what Park Plus is looking for when it's looking for what type of value am I doing calculations about. So again, 75,000, 50,000, and then 100 units. So now I've got my land uses built in terms of the information that supports them. Now there are a couple of other fields that we'll need to build in. One will be land use. So that's going to be the type of use that the model is looking for. So things like general retail or condominium or office, so we can categorize it based on the type of land use. And then the other is going to be that adjusted rate, and that's from calibration, but since we're creating a new land use, we'll want to go in and give it some adjusted rate based on other land uses in the area. So let's start with the use. One of the most important things about the use itself is you have to get the nomenclature right, or Park Plus won't recognize it. And so most of you that have training materials at the back end of your training manual, there's a list of common land uses that are built into the Park Plus model. And we can always go add more as we are modeling or building or developing, but these are the ones that are in place now. And so they've got a specific name and spelling. And if you spell apartments wrong with a Z at the end instead of an S, Park Plus doesn't recognize it because it's looking for that spelling and nomenclature. So what I typically do, just to make sure that I'm not misspelling it, because I can be a little bit dyslexic sometimes when I'm typing it in, is I will go back in to my attribute table with all of the features, and I will look for similar uses. So for the residential, I would look for condominiums. Just copy that and paste it in. If I'm looking at retail, I would just look at general retail, copy that, paste it in. And again, same thing for office, so that I'm getting the correct spelling that's consistent with everything else. Park Plus will run, and it will give you no results for that because it won't be able to find that in the table. Now, the other thing we can do with adjusted rates are, you see we've got null values, and then everything else has got some value based on how it's been calibrated or set up in the previous iterations of the model. And so for this example, again, I'll close this for a second. This was an office park where there were 3 office towers. We did parking occupancy for those 3 office towers, and we're able to calibrate the office demands by time of day based on those occupancy counts. The new stuff like retail, restaurant, and residential, there was no comparable land use on site. So when we've added that in, we've used ULI and ITE to define what those rates are by time of day for shared parking. So if I go back in to my land use here, you'll see that a lot of these are nice, clean, 1.4, 2.6, 3.4. But if I look at office, we've got some really specific decimal places because that's where it's gone in and calibrated those values based on the actual data that we had in the field. So what we typically do is we will do an average, unless there's some large outliers, we'll do an average of the demand characteristics for each of the land uses and for the time of day so we can mimic shared parking by time of day. And so I've just happened to have an example of that here, but this is what it looks like for this model. So I've gone in and done those averages, and there's a couple ways you can do it, and I'll show you both examples. But these are the averages by time of day for office, retail, and residential in this model. And again, retail and residential are based on ULI, so you see that they are nice and clean. Office, lots of decimal places because it was developed by a model. What you can do in this model, if you want to do the average, there's a couple of ways you can do it. So let's say we want to do office. So I'll select all of the office that are not null, and I'll go back into just showing the selected records only in the attribute table. And there's 2 ways. One is to let GIS do it for you. You can just simply go in and look at your statistics, and it will tell you what the mean value is. This is a bit cumbersome. You got to go through and write each one of them down or note it in an Excel table somewhere. But what I like to do is just copy these. So I'll copy the selected. I'll go back into my Excel table that I've got, and we'll just paste those in there. And what I can do now is just do an average of these. So it's just simple Excel arithmetic. So then I've got the same values that I've got up here. So I did that exercise earlier this morning as I was prepping for this, and those are the values that I've got for office, for residential, and for retail. So that gives me my shared parking by time of day values if I want to put those in. Now, the other thing you can do, so once you've got that put together, you would go in and manually input those in your new, let's just see here, where's our new facilities? Let's just select those. So in our new ones, we would just go in and manually input for each use those values, or you could put a unique identifier in there and bring the Excel table in and do a calculation for those that are a little more GIS savvy. But another thing we can do is just give them all zeros to start off with. Let's just do this real quick. So give them all zeros, and the reason I do that is because if they've got null values in there, again, Park Plus is not going to recognize them in one of the fields that it's looking for. So I give them all zeros. I'll save my edits, and I'll stop editing. I can actually go into the interface, and it'll do it for me. So if I click New Development, and I click and select those that I've just built into it, it now brings those in. And so there's my values that I put in, 75,000 square feet, 50,000. So you really could go in and put zeros for every value, just clearing out the nulls when you set this up, and do all of your interacting and interfacing here if you wanted to. I just find it a little bit easier to go into GIS and do that. But then I could go in and I could set my adjusted rate based on whatever the maximums were. So let's go back into our table again. So for office, my maximum is about 2.57. For retail, it's 4. And for residential, it's 0.985. So if I was to go in and put 0.985, for retail, put 4, and then put, what were we here again? We were 2.57. So when I click Save, that goes in and updates the attribute table for me. And so if you're really only concerned with looking at peak conditions with this model, you can simply go in and type them in there. And now Park Plus has updated that attribute table with those peak conditions. And that's what we're going to work with today, so you don't have to watch me manually input a bunch of data. But if you're not concerned with shared parking, you can go through that interface and it will put in the same value for every hour. If you are concerned with shared parking, you'll need to do a manual input or a data transfer using Excel. So there's that. So we've got everything built in. Our land uses are built in. We've closed our editing session. So now all we've got to do is go in and run our model. So we'll click Run, and we'll see what the new land uses do to the results from our model based on adding those in. And we didn't add any parking in with it, and we did not allocate any of the land use demand to parking. So we should see a deficit and an increase in our latent demand because we're now basically creating a new friction point with land use. So we'll see what that is, and then our next step will be to build parking associated with that so that you can see what the offset of that would be with parking. So we've got 3,200 spaces of demand. We were at about 2,700, so we've added about 500 spaces of demand for that land use. Supply didn't change. Our surplus changed, and now we're at negative 138, negative 150-ish deficit, if you will. And our latent demand went up considerably by about 300 spaces. So now we've made it more difficult for a lot of these land uses to park in the area because this is taking whatever it can that's available in public parking, and then it's got a deficit after that. So our next step would be, let's build some parking associated with it and see what we can do. So just like previously, we'll go in, and I'm going to take these guys out just so we're not confused with what we're working with. And now we're going to go in and start editing the parking. So just like previously, we'll go to Create Features, except this time we'll click Parking. I'll do a rectangle, and we're going to build some below-grade parking underneath this. So there we go. We got a parking facility that we've now thrown underneath there. Now another way that you can go input the data other than going through the attribute table like I did last time is just go through the attributes over here. So everything's null, and there's a lot less to put in with our parking. We're really only concerned with the type of parking, and we'll make this restricted parking. The number of spaces, we're going to put in 400 spaces. The name, new parking, we're going to call this one restricted because we're going to restrict that to our land use. I'm not going to put in any price because I'm not concerned with that, so I'll leave it null. And then we'll go in and put in, let me do the same name here. 2 name fields just to make sure that it's reading it, and then 400 spaces here. Now I'm not going to go in and put any occupancy data in because we want Park Plus to tell us what that is. That's the benefit of this modeling is if I go in and I put a parking facility in, the model will tell us how well it's going to fill up based on the parameters that are associated with it. So again, we'll save our edits, stop editing because we don't want to be in an edit session when we run it. And we'll go in, and the last thing we want to do before we run this, let's go to the allocation, so parking allocation by land use, and let's create a relationship with that parking facility. So we've selected it. There's our new parking restricted. And then we're going to show all 3 of these, and we'll select all of them, and we're going to restrict that parking to that land use. So now if I go in, I've got that relationship built into the model now. So I'll save that, and then I can go run this thing. So now we're running it, and we've created parking at 400 spaces. Even though the demand for our facility is about 500 some odd spaces, we should be able to offset a lot of that latent demand and then see still what's kind of missing to satisfy the needs of that development. And then one of the next things we can do is actually build in some public supply in that facility so that we can offset some of the other latent demand that is around the area. So as it's wrapping up the modeling here, we see that our facility that we added in, if we go in and look at basically how it's filling up, I used the identify tool and just clicked on the parking facility. It's basically filling up to 90% occupancy throughout the day, which is my maximum occupancy that I've set in the model. So it fills up to 90%, and once it gets to 90%, nobody else goes in there just because of the way we've modeled this. So I could bump that up to 95% or 100% and let a few more people in, but we're kind of modeling the effective capacity of the facility as well. So then the other thing that I can look at is, let's look at latent demand and look at what's still happening on that site. So the residential demand still has a latent demand of about 2 spaces. So from my perspective, 2 spaces of latent demand is probably satisfied by that 10% cushion that I've got. We're okay with our latent demand on site. So 400 spaces satisfy the demands of the development, fills up to 90% occupancy, so we've pretty much built a parking facility that meets the needs of that development. But at the same time, we've still got 274 spaces of latent demand in these facilities that are green. So maybe we can build in a little bit of public parking to support those and the spillover that they're having with some of their issues. So let's go in and do that. So again, I'm going to take these out just so that I'm not confusing myself as to what I'm working with, and I'll start editing my parking again. And just like I did with land use, I'm going to select this one, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it, and this time we'll put it in parking because we're adding more parking. So when I go into my attributes, I've got the restricted, and I've got this new one that I've copied, and we're going to call it something different. We're going to call it public. We're going to call this one public. So now I'm going to change this to 300 spaces because our latent demand was about 275, and we'll test it at that. And we'll leave everything the same, no costs, no occupancy, all those things. So let's save our edits. Let's stop our editing. And then one thing I'll check before we go in and run this, let's make sure that it's not here in this table anywhere. So we'll sort this by name. And our new parking is not in the table anywhere. These are all of our old parking facilities. So we're good. That new parking is not allocated to anything. It is public supply. It's available to anybody that's got spillover issues or transient demand needs. So let's run that again. So now we're running it, and what we should see as a result of this is a lot of these land uses in this area that are walkable to this parking facility will no longer have that latent demand, or will have a lessened latent demand because they're able to now park in that public facility. So as that's wrapping up, we had about 270 spaces of latent demand in the last one. We've now got about 110. Our surplus has gone up because we've added new parking. And if we look at how that's parking, we can go in and look at the public parking and see that those 300 spaces are filling up to 90% occupancy throughout the day. So we might be able to even add more spaces into that. And you can do this iteratively by adding 25, 50, 100 spaces to see at what point do we stop filling up to maximum occupancy, and when do we start limiting some of the effectiveness of this to be able to meet public demands. So then the other thing we can look at, and let me close my interface for a second, but we have, again, let's look at the site as a whole. We've been looking at this parking facility and this land use, but up here in the top corner, I've got these 2 parking facilities that are showing at less than 50% occupied. And a lot of that has to do with, A, the walking distance. So these 2 over here, if I measure that out, from this land use to the middle of here is 550 feet, 530 feet, is greater than the 450 that we modeled. So we can either go in and increase our walking distance. The other thing that we've got is this is probably restricted. So if I go in and select this facility, we can get information about it from the attribute table. So again, I'm going to select just those that are selected. And so we see that this is facility G2, so our garage 2, and these are the different users that are using it. And if I go over and look at the occupancy from the model, and we're looking at 2 p.m., so let's look at what's happening at 2 p.m. If I sort that, we've got 3 uses that are below 50%, one that's between 50 and 75, and then a couple that are greater than 80%. So I'll focus my efforts on this one. Let's look at, or let's select this one as well. So these 3, or 4, I'm sorry. Let's look at those. So those are roughly 72 spaces that are out there that are being underutilized because they are specifically restricted to the retail uses in that building. So if I go in and find those parking facilities in my allocation and simply remove them and make them public parking facilities, theoretically we should be able to put some portion of that 72 back into the supply and offset that latent demand. And so to do that, it looks just like this. So let's make this a little bigger. So I'm going to go into the tools, and I'm going to do my parking allocation by land use. So I've sorted my parking facilities by name. I'll go back into the table. We're looking for G2 and then these 4 uses. So let's go in and find those and take them out. So let's see, G2, just saw it. All right, so I believe one of them was retail expansion P3, so there we go. Let's take that one out. So I can select all of those and we'll just delete those. One of them is residential 3 retail P3, so let's look for that one. There we go. So we'll remove that one. One of them is Rec 3 Retail B P1. So it's a very odd naming convention, but that's what the client's calling it. So Rec 3 Retail B P1. So we'll delete those. And then the last one is Rec 3 Retail A P1. So let's go up, and I think that was the next one up. So each one of them was restricted to several land uses. We're deleting those. Now they're no longer in the system. They are now considered public supply by the model. So if I go run this one more time, what we should see here is opening up those spaces to public supply is going to free up some of that pent-up latent demand in the area, and we should see the utilization of those facilities go up from less than 50% to somewhere higher, maybe in the 85–90% range, because we're now allowing people to park there. So latent demand actually went up. So what happened when the latent demand went up is these uses, so if I go in and select this use, that's some of our retail uses that were using those facilities. So I've taken those away, so now they're competing for uses. But if I look at the facilities themselves, they've all gone up. So we've increased the utilization of the facilities. And so now we go through this exercise, and it's kind of this balancing act of how do we start taking away private and restricted parking and sharing parking within a site like this. And so we'll go through several iterations of doing that. But you can see that we've now impacted the occupancy of that facility, and we're getting better use out of it, which should help us from having to build so much additional parking. So everything's kind of greater than 50% in the 80% range in our peak hour. So that's kind of looking at shared parking strategies and creating, you know, new opportunities. So the next thing I might do is go in and open this one up and see if we can offset this latent demand for these 2 uses. But again, it's an iterative procedure that we go through and try to make work. So then lastly, kind of one of the last scenarios that we may look at is, all right, so we're modeling this based on today's conditions, but what would happen if we looked at changes to mode split, if walking was higher, or and in this case, internal capture in the site was higher. So let's go in and look at that multimodal factor. And so for this, we've got one type of user, which is general, and we've got 1% biking, 2% walking, 7% taking the bus. So those 7% taking the bus are coming from outside of the site, taking the bus to work or taking the bus to the retail, and ending up on the site. The 1% biking, a lot of them are doing the same. They're coming from outside, but the walking trips are logically generating inside the site. So the residential is walking to the retail, or the residential is walking to the restaurant, or office is walking to the retail and restaurant. So it serves as kind of an internal capture. We don't need to create a parking space for that, because they parked at their office or residential use and they're walking to the other uses in the site. So what happens if we bump that up from, say, 2%, which is relatively low for a mixed-use site like this, to, say, 10%? And then there are traffic generation manuals that will give you kind of a basis for selecting that number, but let's just jump to 10%. So again, I save that, and I'll go back and run this once again. And so now what it's doing is it's taking that amount of demand right off the top of the demand calculations for each of the land uses that are affected by that. And so we should see our overall demand go down, because that demand is now being facilitated by walking trips. We're no longer assuming that people are parking here, getting in their car, and they're parking over here and driving around the site. So our latent demand went from 140 to 35, and our surplus has gone up. And so, again, we're iteratively walking through different components of what this site might look like in the future. And so then the next step for me, if I was doing this for this client, was let's go back and revisit our garage and start coming back down with the number of spaces that we need, so that we're not building a 700-space garage if we don't actually need to build that, and can offset it with some shared parking and some walkable or bikeable improvements. So again, this is kind of the nature of a scenario plan, as you go through and you start defining different parameters, and then changing those parameters and coming back and revisiting the first parameters, and so on. So with that was about 30 minutes of a 5-step scenario planning process. What questions do you have? Did any of it not make sense, and what can we answer to help you there?
Brett, this is Kurt. One question I would have, I saw that you put in the new land use and you popped the garage underneath it and gave it a value. Wouldn't it be just simpler just to kind of sit down and I'm going to put in the building and say, okay, now tell me how big of a garage I have to build?
Yes, and you can do that. So what you would do in that situation is you would draw the land use in, you would let it run like the first time we did in that scenario, and then you'd go in and understand what the demand was from that building. So we could go in and look at the latent demand, we could do a selection area of that building and understand what was being generated and what was not being met by other facilities. And so those two numbers will tell us how big the garage needs to be. And so I kind of took a swag at that at 400 spaces, because that's what the latent demand was. But that's kind of that's naturally how you would do that process, is model the land use, understand what's not being met, and then build a garage to meet those needs.
Okay.
Hey, Brett, on that same example, you were saying that you put that first parking structure under there with 400 spaces, and then you put the second one under at 300 spaces. Are you saying that total parking underneath is 700, or are you saying that 300 out of the 400 are public and not private?
So I'll select it and show you. So if I go into my parking layer now, so I've got two facilities, one at 300 and one at 400. So we're assuming in this example there's 700 spaces.
Okay.
And again, now that we've gone through this 5th step of looking at mode split and looking at different shared parking, I would now go back in and start adjusting those numbers down until the site was balanced. So we start at 700 and maybe we end up at 500 or something like that.
Right. Okay.
Anybody else? So again, this is kind of like taking a drink from a fire hose. So it's a lot of information we're throwing at you in about 30 minutes. The intent is to just kind of whet your appetite with it. And as you're using this, or as you step into using this or have more questions, you can certainly revisit this on the two different websites. And again, for those that jumped on late, there's the user group website, which a lot of y'all are already members of. And if you're not, let me know, and I'll get you a login information. There's no cost associated with that. It's a repository of information for you as users of Park Plus to be able to find out how to use it, different videos, connect with one another as users. So let me know. Secondarily, there is the Kimley Horn website where there's just general information, and these are up there, the Lunch and Learn videos. And so I'll upload this one after the end of this call to the user group site, and then get it moved into the Kimley Horn site so you can find it. But revisit this, take a look at it, look at your training materials, and then, we're always here if you have questions. Just come back and let us know. So let me just jump back into the presentation here, one of these.
Can I ask one quick question by chance?
Absolutely.
All right. So when we have land uses and then parking, but then we also have ways to extend people's walking tolerance. Is there a way that we can add in bike share programs to then expand how far that last mile of trips that people can go? Is that something that will come in future versions, maybe?
Well, so that's a good question. And in the current iteration of this model, you're looking at mode split or bike use or walking as a function of the entire study area. We're working to develop a kind of nodal-based or location-based system, but for those that are on the call that are GIS savvy, that requires network analysts. The ability to go in and look at specific networks and look at specific locations, and there's not been enough of a push from a lot of our clients to use network analysts. And I know, Eric, you and I have talked about this before, but going in and creating networks of where bike use is or walking is would strengthen the ability to predict where people are going to park. We just haven't gotten that deep yet, but we certainly are trying to figure that out and would welcome any input from those that would like to look at that. Now, the other thing with bike share is we can look at bike demand by land use, but again, because it's study area based and not zone or land use based, it's going to make the assumption that, again, in this model, let me go here. In this model, which is relatively simplistic, it's going to assume that 1% of every land use, the demand is offset by people biking to work. So for this land use here, if the demand is 150 spaces, it's going to assume that 1.5 people are coming by bike. And if this one is 70, it's going to assume that 0.7 people are coming by bike. And so then we can figure out what the demand for those bike parking issues are and be able to put that into the model and show where you might need to locate it. And we had started going down that road with the University of Washington a couple of years ago, but we just didn't get the data to be able to do it. So those are a couple of things that are on the drawing board that we would welcome the user group to help us figure out how to do that, to make that more applicable.
Okay, like a zone overlay that you would then, you have a bike location at a certain point, and that zone overlay would then decrease the rest of those, knowing that you had a certain amount of use. Anyway,
right. I mean, in your example, like, so you're downtown Lincoln, I'm going to guess that the Haymarket is going to have more use than the government area. And so it'd be good to be able to go in and say, okay, Haymarket's got high bike utilization versus general or the government area, which is pretty minimal. But right now, all you're able to do is go in and apply this for the whole study area.
Right, okay. All right. We're just getting more and more into B-cycles and whatnot, so.
Absolutely, and from our perspective, a lot of people are starting to look at that more in depth, and we want this model to be agile and adapt enough to be able to respond to that.
Thank you.
All right, so so let me just kind of wrap up here. We got a couple minutes left. So what's next? We're going to do one more lunch and learn this year, and the one scenario that we did not touch on today that is a big one is events, and so I wanted to spend pretty much an entire lunch and learn to talk about events because they can be easy as just turning on a stadium and as complicated as creating a festival with traffic implications and walking implications and different areas of demand. And so we want to talk about that as kind of the next lunch and learn and where we go from there. We're also going to try to do an upcoming user group meeting that's not a lunch and learn. And this has been, I hope this has been helpful to most of y'all in this setting. And anything we can do to help y'all with kind of learning and continued use of this is great. But what we'd like to do towards the end of the year is a user group meeting to talk about what you'd like to get out of the next year of Park Plus, and what support we can provide to kind of keep this thing going. That's what we're kind of looking for that. So fall into the year, we'll do a webinar for that. We'll also do another lunch and learn, and that'll be kind of where we go from there. But again, any suggestions or things you need between now and then, don't hesitate to ask. And then finally, if you have any feedback, don't hesitate to call me or email me or let me know what's going on. You know, we've stressed this a lot, but the intent of this model is for you to get use out of it, and this group is getting varied use out of it. Some are touching it, some are not, some are building new things, and so just make sure that we're providing the support we need for you to get this thing off the ground in your community, and then maybe we can connect you with other folks as well. So that's all I've got for today. If there are any other questions, I'll take them now. If not, I will give you 6 minutes of your life back today to go answer emails or eat lunch. So
I'll take the 6 minutes, thanks.
okay. Thank y'all. Yeah, thank y'all very much for joining today. Again, if you don't have a user group login for the site, let me know, and we'll get you logged in, and we'll be talking to all of you soon.
Yeah, hey, Brett?
Yes, sir?
Brett, it's
Yes.
Kurt. I do not have any user group login, so when you get a chance.
Will do. I'll get you set up, okay?
Okay.
Thank y'all.
Thank y'all.
Bye.